Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Engagers, once again, we have today another educator, and this educator is John. But before we get started, John, are you prepared to engage?
I definitely am.
Let's do this. Because John Fallon is an English teacher at Notre Dame High School in West Haven, Connecticut. He has designed Dolus, Finding the Journal of Odysseus, an immersive ARG alternate reality game designed to augment his students' exploration of Homer's Odyssey. He has also co-designed Blind Protocol with past guest Paul Darvasi in an inter-school ARG for his 9th grade students and instructs on research, skills, and privacy-related current events. He has also developed lessons to teach commercial games like Her Story as literary texts. And his game-based learning work has been featured on National Public Radio's MindShift, Edutopia, several books from Carnegie Mellon, ETC Press, and Peter Lang's Publishing, BAM Radio Network, and District Administration Magazine. And he is also a fellow podcaster of the Good Game podcast that he hosts together with Tobias Staaby. I'm not sure how to pronounce that one.
He lets me say Staaby, so I assume that's close enough.
Sounds good. Is there anything we're missing from your, everyday life, John, that you'd like to mention?
No, just that, I love playing games, and, I'm really passionate about bringing that kind of stuff into the classroom to kind of reinvigorate, school for everybody. And, I definitely try to do it with my 2 daughters as well, who are currently downstairs. Hopefully they should stay stuck down there for a while.
And if they come to say hello, we'll get a big welcome from them, I'm sure.
Sure. Yeah, they'll be very excited.
That's fantastic, John. And before we get into, sort of the hard questions, we would like to know, what does a regular day with you look like? Because we know you're teaching, I guess, but what does it look like besides, of course, including teaching as well?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's definitely, playing, I would say, an extremely challenging game of getting my 2 daughters ready to get out the door. That involves a lot of negotiation most mornings, and then get them to school. And then, then it's a school day. And, sometimes it's a typical school day of, reading and writing and class discussion. But I also try to bring in as many games, even on a small scale, like debate games and things like that. And then when I get home, it's usually playing with the girls, getting things ready, just kind of, getting through the end of the day. And then if it's a good day and I have time, I'll usually end my days with about, an hour or so of either reading or playing a game of some type.
Either or.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Sounds great. I hope that happens more often than for me, at least,
Yeah.
Which has been lately a bit cramped with activities. That's all good as well. So, John, we would like to get started, with one of the sort of strong questions, and one that always leads us to great learning. And it's about a story of what you would like to call perhaps your favorite fail or first attempt in learning, when, of course, creating or using games in your classroom or gamification, which, of course, you learned a lot from. It actually set you for future success, or you had a great comeback from that experience. Can you tell us such a story?
Sure. I mean, I would say almost any time you're using games or gamification in class, like, it is going to be a failure to a degree. It just kind of depends on how much. Because you're never gonna know exactly how it pans out, or it's gonna also vary wildly with the kids that happen to be in the room. So something that worked last year might not work the year after. So I think what is both really, engaging about game design, especially for the classroom, but also frustrating, is that you do need to be ready to do a lot of iteration. Like your first draft, just like writing or anything else, is not going to be enough, and you kind of have to constantly be tinkering with it. So I would say I've experienced some degree of failure almost every time, I launch, a game-based learning experience. But one that was probably a major one was when I was working with Paul on Blind Protocol, our privacy ARG. Whole phase set up. We had this whole phase set up that was going to be about research. And we had this idea that, okay, we'll give them a bunch of topics on these different privacy and digital security related things. They'll have all these tags that they have to look up, names, people, events, organizations, concepts, and then they'll create a master document that is full of links on all of these things. And then we'll lock them into that document after a certain period of time, and they can only do their research from that to kind of turn it into a game. And what we realized was once they made that document, they completely ignored it. And it was because that's not really how research works today. Like, it's a very antiquated way of looking at research of like, oh, you get the right stack of books and then you're fine. And then we realized, no, research is ad hoc. You have a question you need to answer, and then you go looking specifically for something for that question. So it was a total whiff as far as building in this research element. And, we completely changed it for the second iteration. And it was definitely a wake-up call that sometimes what really seems like it makes sense on paper and to you doesn't make sense once you put it in front of students, sometimes because it just didn't work, or sometimes because you realize, I'm actually not thinking about this from a modern perspective. I'm not thinking about this from their perspective of how they're going to navigate these challenges. So that was definitely a good moment of failure for sure.
And something that I'm sure you learned from, and maybe there are some things that you would apply differently. But also, I think one of the main learnings here in this experience and in your story, I would say, is the fact of being open to that iteration, to that learning from, when you hit the ground. I think that's one of the fundamental things I take from your story. Is there anything else you'd like to highlight, John, from your story?
No, I would just say it's necessary. I think if you go in hoping that it's going to be kind of like a pass, fail, success or failure, and that's it, I think you're going to be, maybe end up turning yourself off from really great experiences. I think you have to go into almost any teaching experience, but I think especially a game-based learning experience, knowing some things are going to work, some things are not, and just be ready to look for those, as well as solicit it in direct feedback, because sometimes you can be surprised that something you thought worked didn't, and vice versa.
Yes, and is there any quick pointer that you could lead us into how to get that feedback? Because I think it's a very important and interesting topic.
I just kind of asked them directly with kind of anonymous Google form surveys, and I just let them know that hey, I'm going to be using these to make changes. And the students, I think when you actively solicit their feedback, they're usually pretty thoughtful, and they do a good job of letting you know what worked and what didn't. And I think by making it anonymous, you're saying look, I'm not going to be judging you on this. It's not going to make me, like you less or grade you differently. This is just for you to tell me, what you thought of the experience.
Fantastic. That sounds great. And changing the, sort of the tables a little bit. And would you say that there's, I would like to have a story of one, interesting challenge, a big challenge that you faced, and you actually solved using these principles, either a game in the classroom or a game you created or something along those lines. Can you give us a story, again, of a success, a big challenge that you actually faced, head on with these things, and, the first, second, or the third time it actually came out to be a success?
Well, whenever I'm an English teacher, so whenever I'm trying to build a game-based unit, I'm always trying to think of how can I mix the old and the new? How can I get them reading deeply, but also get it to be innovative and engaging and give them something new and different at the same time? So one of my favorite things that I teach is Her Story, which is a narrative focused game by Sam Barlow. And when I was using that, I realized okay, this is an unreliable narrator, and I knew I wanted that to be the theme that the unit was built around. So I tried to think of how I could wrap in other unreliable narrators, and the first thing that came to my mind was, oh, I know, I'm going to use the same thing that games have been using forever, which is leveling up. Start them easy, start them with the most basic skills, and then gradually give them different, mini bosses, if you will, that are increasingly more challenging and require different types of skills, just like you would find in games going back for decades. So then I built kind of a level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4, different short stories that were increasingly difficult in different ways before letting them off to the final boss, which was playing the game, her story, basically by themselves, with little feedback from me. So turning the learning experience into a game itself, even with just kind of like subtle framing, I think made a huge difference. And I think it's the best thing that I teach.
That sounds great. And again, I'd like to go a bit deeper on this one. And you were talking about sort of building up to that final boss, which was the actual game. Mm-hmm. What are some pointers, or can you give us any ideas of what you did there? Because we want to, again, the idea in this question is we always like to listen to these experiences, maybe inspire some of our listeners who might be educators as well, who might be professors, or who might be doing something else, but might be inspired by your stories. Or is there any details that you can give us about how this looked?
Sure. Yeah. So it starts with, and some years I've done it when I'm feeling a bit more, mischievous. I'll sometimes start a class with the unit with the game already running on the screen. And I'll ask them if they want to, play a game and with, an unreliable narrator and try to figure out the mystery. And of course, they're all like extremely engaged and are foaming at the mouth to get started. But then I'll just unplug it and say, no, you guys aren't good enough yet. We have to start at level 1. And I'll throw a short story in front of them by Shirley Jackson, Charles, which has a great, just kind of little subtle narrative twist at the end that's kind of very easy to grasp. And it's kind of a story where you read it the first time and you think one thing, you get the twist at the end. And when you read the story again, you realize that there were clues the whole time. So it's a very kind of black and white interpretation. And then I gradually level them up with different stories. And I use a graphic organizer that has them pulling every quote related to different motives, why they might be unreliable, and kind of forcing them to kind of collect evidence and think like a detective, basically, and recording the evidence that they're being given by the unreliable narrator, so they can cross-reference it and compare and contrast, and basically just build skeptical self-defenses when being presented with an unreliable narrative. And then by the time they get through all 4 stories, and the 4th one is In a Grove, which most people know by the film adaptation Rashomon, and that one is just to show them that sometimes there isn't an answer. Like sometimes you can navigate your way and there's different interpretations and it's very complex, but you can get to an answer. Maybe it's subjective, but there's at least an answer. But in a Grove, Rashomon, there is no answer. Everything contradicts each other and it's just a complete mess. So that's just kind of like a little epistemological curveball for them at the end, that sometimes you just have to realize you're not going to be able to get the answer to everything and be ready to deal with that. And then after that curveball, that's when I sit them down in front of her story. I give them a very brief, rundown of like how it works, like how they can use search terms to search for the clips that the game is made of, and how it's non-linear, and how they have to pay attention to not only what's being said, but the time and the date, so they can kind of cross-reference it and build their own timeline. And then I just let them go, and they go nuts for it. Like they sit there, they refuse to go to the bathroom. I've had times where I've had to kick guys out of my room, not because they want to keep playing the game, but because they want to finish their notes about the game. That's how engaging a good kind of organic, challenging experience can be. And that's actually something that I'm really becoming passionate about, is trying to eliminate this trope that students are lazy and they don't want challenge. They do want challenge, but they just want it to be, authentically contextualized. Like make it something that they see as a engaging challenge, not just an abstract challenge, which is what most traditional schoolwork is. Because I have students who work their butt off taking notes, and I have to kick them out because they want to keep taking notes. But that's because they're enjoying the challenge instead of just having it thrown in their face and told, you have to do this because I said so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I love these kinds of stories because they come to show part of the power of using something that is engaging and that is interesting for the students, And of course, when you have them in that attitude, even if nothing else, they will be more open to whatever learning is going on. So this is something I'm super passionate about. I truly believe in this, and I've been talking about it for a while. We do webinars at the university, which is a completely different level, but you would be surprised by how many similar problems in that sense you find as well with both the engagement as you were mentioning, like the authenticity of what is going on, how relevant and interesting it can be for them. I think there are so many things in common there and so many interesting stuff. And I love your story about this and about, those kids staying at the end, taking more and more notes, which is actually schoolwork. I mean,
yeah, it's work.
Exactly. It's the typical thing that people are saying. As you were saying, that they're lazy, that they don't want to be there. They're saying, like school is like jail or something like that, and it's completely different. You can flip that script, and that's possible. And gamification, game-based learning, and all these strategies are definitely one of the roads that can lead you to such a place. So thank you very much for that story. I loved it, John.
Yeah, and I think just another point about that, I think, like you said, it's just one of the roads. I'm not one of those people that says game-based learning is the only way. I think it's an important way, and I think it's one that all teachers should at least be familiar with. But the other thing about it is that it's new, and I think we forget how boring school is for students because we are giving them the same script over and over and over again. Starting probably since like kindergarten or first grade, it's not that different. And they've been doing it for, usually a decade or more by the time they get to you. And I think we forget how boring that is.
Yeah. And how I mean, even, I don't know what your experience in particular was, but I mean, even if it wasn't for you personally, which could be the case for many of the people who are listening, maybe you had a great time in school. But do you remember looking around and seeing people who just wanted like to run out the door and never come back? Well, that's part of what you have to look to stop. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, learning can be so exciting. There's so many things that are useful, necessary there in school, in the university, in graduate school. I mean, why would we shy away from making it more exciting and actually engaging so that people really learn? That's my message. So I think you wanted to say something else, John.
Yeah, no, I'll just say, like, I'm an English teacher. I did not particularly enjoy English class. And, I had some great teachers, but by the time I got, to, 8th, 9th, 10th grade, like, I had already done it a million times. Occasionally I would get a book thrown my way that was interesting, but, I had written essay after essay after essay. I'd read, the same dusty canonical book that had been read for 50 years. With some occasionally that did break through, but most of the time it was boring. And the only time that it got mixed up was when either a teacher took a risk and like gave us like a text that was like really dramatically different, or in the case of my 9th grade teacher who inspired me to be a teacher, used games. And that like completely blew my mind as far as like, oh wait, this can be different. This doesn't have to be the same thing over and over again. And that was actually part of my journey to becoming a teacher, was seeing that it can be different.
Nice. Love that. And John, when you're thinking of building these experiences for your students, again, whether it's taking a game that already exists, or even if you're building a game, well, those would probably be two different things, but any of the two you want to go down, can you tell us if you have some sort of process, some sort of, mental structure to go about this? How do you do it? How do you bring a game to your class, or how do you build a game for your class?
I think the overarching question is, I think about, okay, what skills do I want to strengthen for my students? So like for her story, I wanted critical thinking, skepticism, close reading, and, the ability to, kind of take evidence and be able to kind of compare it over, a broad context within a narrative. So once I realized that her story could provide those skills, that's when I began building a unit around it. So it's often for me about skills and what muscles does playing this game force you to strengthen, so to speak. And then I would say a bit more specifically as an English teacher, I definitely have obviously a bias toward writing. So I often ask myself, okay, with these skills and this experience, how can I get them to write about it? And if I can see a kind of engaging and again authentic writing experience that could go along with it, not just another 5 paragraph essay about pick a theme and give me the quotes. That is usually the boxes that I'll kind of put the game inside of in order to build an authentic and hopefully fun learning experience out of it.
That makes a lot of sense. And again, I'm going to hold you to the fire once again. When you're thinking, oh, I want to do this unit. How do you go about maybe if you're going to look for a game that is existing, or if you find a game and you want to adapt it to your class? Like, how does your like brain process this? How do you go about it? Like, oh, I found this again, the game that you just mentioned, this game, Her Story. And I want to use it in class. Or was it, oh, I'm looking for a game that, finds this and that, and you found her? Like, how does it work? What has been your experience at least?
So for Her Story, for example, I came across a review that said like, oh, this is a really complex narrative. And as an English teacher, anytime I see a game that has, like authentic narrative or really complex or engaging narrative, I'm probably going to pay attention to it because it's a text that could easily make the transition into an English class, which uses fictional text kind of as its mainstay. So for me, that's kind of like the lane, you will, that kind of transports it from game into my classroom. But for Her Story, when I played it, again, it goes back to skills. I realized playing it required me to use close reading skills that I already want my students to be using. The same way that they would be reading a text or using a short story. So when I realized that those skills were not just ancillary to the game, but actually required to play the game, that's how I knew I had to bring it into the classroom, and that's when I started building the unit around it. So again, it comes back to those mental muscles. If those mental muscles that I already want my students to be developing, if they're strengthened by playing the game, that is going to make it really hard not to try to find a way to bring it into my classroom.
Absolutely. That's what makes the most sense. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. And John, what would you say is something that is sort of a best practice, or something that almost any, educator or professor who's thinking of bringing games to the class, whichever way it is, again, creating your games or finding games around, that would be a best practice to do this? Like, is there kind of a silver bullet? But I know there's no really silver bullets for most things, but what would that look like, perhaps?
For like finding good games to use in class?
For example, yeah. A good
It's
practice.
hard,
Like, do you go into review sites? Do you consult? I don't know. It could be something like that, or it could be, when you're picking a game, make sure that it's not too long, or I don't know, whatever that could look like.
There's all kinds of, there's both like the thematic and the logistical. I would say, logistically speaking, for most teachers, one of the things that it makes Her Story, I think, a phenomenal game to use in class is because even if you dive to like 100% and finding every clip and watching every single second of the interviews, it's maybe 3 hours. So, something that kind of fits that, kind of short story to novel length consumption is going to make a lot more sense. Like, as much as it would be really interesting to play a 25-hour game and like break down the narrative, most teachers are not going to have the time and the ability, to do that, especially with a larger classroom. So you definitely want to look for, and what's good is actually, I think economically, we're going to start seeing shorter game experiences. As much as we'll always get like, the Skyrims and the Red Dead Redemptions that are, dozens of hours long on purpose, I think with things like the Xbox Game Pass, you're going to start seeing shorter game experiences that are in those like 2, 3, 4, 5 hours. So I think for teachers, that's going to be a huge boon, and being able to find ones that just logistically fit in a classroom much easier. The other thing is, yeah, I read a lot of review sites. I'm a big fan of Polygon in particular because they tend to pay attention to more of the not avant-garde, but the bit more like kind of artistic and things, not just like the AAA Call of Duties. So they'll usually get on my radar as something that's a bit different. It might be a bit more narrative focused. So that's usually one of the avenues that gets a game on my radar is, and yeah, it's just play as much as you can. Certainly as a 34-year-old with two kids, that can be difficult, but just trying to get different experiences, because a lot of times when you start playing a game, you'll realize pretty quickly like this would be awesome. This is using those skills that I want my kids to be using. So that's as far as I can tell, it's reviews to kind of see the games that are out there that you're not playing yet, and then just trying to play as many different games as you can on your own to kind of get that moment where you realize, yes, this will work.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. And, after, we've spent quite a few minutes together by now, would you say that there's somebody, and again, I don't know if you've heard the podcast before or not, that doesn't really matter at this point. The question is, if there's, by listening to these questions, to the vibe of the podcast, is there somebody that comes to your mind that you say, oh, I'd like to listen to this person in Professor Game?
Yeah, so one person that comes to mind, if you haven't talked to her already, is Kelly Dunlap. She is kind of a psychologist by background, but she does a ton of work around the psychology of games. And, when I go to her and I talk about, if I have some question about whether it's like, oh, okay, there's this research that's coming out that's saying this terrible thing or this great thing about games, I go to her to be like, okay, what's the real situation? What should I take out of this? And she's just very versed in a wide variety of things around mental health, psychology, all of it around games. So she's been on the Good Game podcast, and she would be a great guest for you. I think everyone should hear more from her.
Definitely. We will get in touch with Kelly. So in that same sense of recommendations, if you could recommend one book to the engagers, what book would that be and why?
So if it's directly related to game-based learning, I would say Matthew Farber's books are really good, especially game-based learning in action, just to see, because he does a good job of like cataloging how teachers actually put things together, which I think especially for newer people can be tough to make that leap from the abstract to the concrete. So he does a really good job of showing that. And then the curveball I would throw is like, just read books that are really interesting to you, where characters have to solve problems. Because I find that oftentimes, especially when I'm designing games, I take a lot of inspiration from like, clever protagonists in novels and like how they're like working their way through problems. Because I made a whole ARG out of Odysseus because that's what he does. So I find like if you just read books where protagonists are like, scrapping their way through problems, whether that's science fiction or fantasy or mystery, that you might find like some really interesting kind of challenges that maybe you could find ways to transform into your classroom.
Fantastic. That makes a lot of sense. In fact, I think reading, it's not just about reading the books that talk about these things. There are always like lateral things that you can find that can be like gems. Things that can really help you. And that approach of looking at the characters and that under those lens can be very interesting as well. Because of course, I would never recommend people to just read some books on one single topic, because you'll run out of books by one, and you'll probably get bored of the topic as well. So that's definitely a great recommendation. And again, finishing up with sort of the recommendations, what would you say is your favorite game?
That's a tough one. It's like asking an English teacher their favorite book. Yeah. So my favorite game, I couldn't answer that. I would say I could tell you my favorite type of game. My favorite type of game is definitely like collectible card games, like Magic the Gathering and things like that. And I've been very happy that they're starting to make the transition into the digital world, like Hearthstone. I will shout out to everyone who likes games like Hearthstone or Magic the Gathering should check out Gwent, which is a spin-off game from the Witcher games, which some people might now be more familiar with because of the Netflix series. Gwent is a card game that started in as like a side game in The Witcher 3 and now has spun out to be its own full-blown CCG. It's very fun, very strategic, and a bit different if you've played other games like Hearthstone, but different in a good way. So those are definitely my favorite type of games because I like the customization. I like the strategy and like the layers of strategy and the meta thinking that you have to use to play. Like, okay, I know this will work, but what if they play that? And then what if they see that? Then I need to play this instead. So just like that rabbit hole of strategic thinking that it forces you to go down. I definitely never get sick of that.
Reminds me back to the days of high school when I played a lot of Magic the Gathering. Until
Yes.
I realized that if you were broke, as most students are, you had a hard time competing with people who were at huge levels and spent a lot of time and money on the cards, which is the only reason I kind of stopped going down that route, because the difference in the advantage, it's like in video games with people who like purchase things, which I'm fine with anybody who decides to go down that route. But it's not my type of thing. I'd rather like earn it myself. And in card games, which are collectible, like Magic the Gathering, which again, I absolutely love. The other day I saw somebody who had those cards and it was like, a quick flashback. I'm also 34 right now, going back to high school, and it was like, oh gosh. I mean, I can't, it's an experience you can't forget. Definitely.
Yeah. And that's what's good is Gwent and others. I think as they're digital, they've done a good job of kind of flattening out that curve that you need to expend, which is good because it can get extremely cost prohibitive in a lot of spaces. But it's fun when they make the investment worth it, which is always a difficult balance.
There was some sort of digital version of Magic the Gathering. It was not incredibly good, but it kind of allowed you to see those cards that you would probably never see in your deck.
Yeah. I think they still have one.
Yeah.
I don't know how it compares. I remember I tried a digital one once, and I just realized that as I've played different card games since Magic the Gathering, that I think the formula has kind of been improved upon. And I find myself not really being able to go back. It's kind of like playing like an old video game, like on the unlike the N64, like when you go back and try to play like a single joystick shooter, compared to the modern one of double joystick, it just doesn't feel right. That's kind of how I feel going back and playing Magic the Gathering. Like I feel like the formula has been improved upon.
Absolutely. Like, I mean, board games back in the day when you had just things in the realm of Monopoly, and you go now today and it's like once you evolve there's so many things that you can do, and so much that we can learn from as well in this world of game-based learning and gamification as well. And in that sense, again, getting back to that, what would you say is your sweet spot, your superpower when talking about game-based learning in the classroom, using games, creating games for the classroom? What would you say is that spot for you?
I don't think I have a superpower, but I think one thing that a mentality that I think helps a lot is to look at games as texts, especially as an English teacher, where I think once you start looking at it in that framework, as in like, what themes and skills does this text provide when you consume it? I think that makes it easier to see how you can import them into your classroom, because English teachers and teachers of that ilk today, they don't blink an eye when someone says, oh, you should read this book, and they think about, oh, I could teach this in class. Like that's not a difficult transition to make. And I think if you think of games the same way, where they're just text like any other, but they're interactive, that just gives different affordances, then I think it's a lot easier to see the opportunities.
Absolutely. And it's definitely what I would call at least a superpower. Not everybody can do it. And in fact, I would argue that right now, at least, most people don't. So
yeah, I think they don't. They can, but I think they don't.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And now we're going to go. We don't always do this. It's just when we have at least some time left for the podcast, we make this random question that comes. It's been curated to make sure, it's a question that makes sense for our guests, but it comes in randomly during the interview. And the question comes from Brian Hardy, or Hart. I'm not sure how to pronounce that one. He asks about one professional secret that he's interested in is in rubrics and metrics to measure learning and achievement outcomes for gamified simulations, and I'm guessing game-based learning and those types of situations. What would you say to that?
Don't tell anybody, but I'm not a huge fan of strict rubrics. I think that it's very important to lay out the expectations and what you're trying to do. But I think when you lock them into rubrics, I think that's almost a backwards way of trying to innovate, where you're trying to take an old tool and apply it to a new problem. So what I try to do is I usually try to make the assignment itself be very clear about what they're trying to do. So like for the example, if I'm saying you need to be able to learn how to read different unreliable narrators, the graphic organizer that they'll use will be based around being able to do that. So if they can complete that assignment, they are doing the skill. So there's probably someone smarter than me could probably tell me what kind of teaching and designing that is, but it's, just make it focused on the skills so that if they do it, then they're doing what you want them to do, as opposed to kind of saying, well, here's a checkbox, and if you get close to this, I might choose one of the better checkboxes, because I feel like it gets very abstract. So the great thing about game-based learning, gamification, is if they succeed at the challenge, then they've done it. It becomes like this pass-fail type of thing where most people will pass. So that's my suggestion, is make it about the skill so that if they do it, they succeed and they know that.
Fantastic. That makes a lot of sense. And it just quickly reminded me of an article I just read. Just read a couple of months ago, probably, about Singapore considering not doing exams anymore. And Singapore, top in the PISA exams. So
yeah, I know.
Interesting thought.
Yeah. I think it's just making about doing things.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what I'm all about.
Absolutely, absolutely. So John, before we just let you go, we would like to know if you have any final quick piece of advice. Of course, where we can find you, if you have any plugs to make, this is the best time to do that. And after that, of course, we will say that at least for now, it's game over.
Yeah. So thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Good.
If you want to hear more about the Odysseus game I made or the Her Story unit that I built and like how I built it, you can check. I have write-ups at thealternateclassroom.org. You could also find me on Twitter at John C. Fallon, Fallon. And then also on the Good Game Pod, which is at Good Game EDU on Twitter, and on Facebook at facebook.com/goodgamepod. We do similar type of guests and kind of trying to find out some of the cool stuff that's going out there in the game-based world that just like this podcast is doing. And there's just so much cool stuff out there. It's a lot of fun.
Absolutely, absolutely, and keep on at it. I have to get into my habit of listening to your podcast as well. However, for now, and at least for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Engagers, it is fantastic to have you here, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with our educator, John. Are you using Instagram? I am now posting stories almost, hopefully, every day and trying to share some nuggets every once in a while as well, and I would love to connect with you there. And just like on Twitter, you can find my username as RobAlvarezB. And before you go on to your next mission, would you like to know what's up in the e-learning guild with gamification? Then all you have to do to listen to Bianca next week is subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. I will see you there.